service. Did you have any experiences at?
Only in travel. When you get below what they call the Mason-Dixon line, I guess a lot of the older people know what that is. That's where north and south changes. You couldn't ride in the front of a bus, or if you were on a train, they put you in a special car. In the north, it didn't make any difference, but once you got to Washington, D.C., where you usually change trains, you had to go into a special car where they put all black people. But I experienced that mostly in the South, but the way we got around it was never to go in town. We stayed on the base all the time.
Now, you're training to possibly give your life for your country. How did that make you feel?
Well, if you thought about it, it made you pretty angry, but the training, we didn't run into any kind of problems in training.
Mm-hmm.
We had the best instructors, I think, in the Air Corps. Of course, our first instructors were black pilots that came out of the CPT program. Nearly every college in the country had a CPT program, civilian pilot training program, because the country is trying to build up a pool of pilots that they figured they could train to be military pilots. So every college, even the women. But of course, naturally, you've heard of the women aviators that when they graduated from their pilot training courses, they became transport pilots. They piloted, you got to give them credit, because they piloted every kind of airplane that the Air Corps had, to transfer them from the factories to different bases and where they were going to be used. And also, when I started my training for the Army Air Corps, all our instructors were white, but you would never know the difference, because they were excellent instructors and they never did anything different from if they were instructing white pilots. But the other cultural things, I could be here the rest of the evening explaining some of the things that happened, especially if we went into different cities or towns in the South. But
We have some Jewish veterans here. How was that experience in the Army?
Sorry about
Jewish veterans.
Well, is there anybody other tan me? I don't know. How about you, Paul?
Well, it was not nearly as bad as it was for black soldiers. That I can tell you. But there were instances where it depended on who you were with, the makeup of your outfit. If there were many lower class people, ordinary working class people who had gotten into the service, or many from southern parts of the country, some of those were in our unit, and even after being in combat together, when you would come out, when somebody had a few drinks, they would tend to forget. And there might be remarks passed, etc. But that still was nothing like the kind of prejudice that you saw with black soldiers. I know with our unit in the Philippines, most black people in the service were not allowed in combat units. They were used in transport to unload ships. The day when the kamikazes hit our unit in Leyte, and just piles of ammunition were blowing up all over the beach, and we were mustered into a group to move that, otherwise everything would have blown up. From out of nowhere, I was working with a group of 5 or 6 people. A couple of us had already been wounded, but we were trying to get that cart out of the way. And from out of nowhere came a black GI, stripped to the waist. I'm sure he had been working unloading an LST or something, and without a word helped us move that cart. It could have blown everybody around to pieces, and then just disappeared into the smoke. Never did find out who he was or where he came from.
Well, actually in boot camp and then in the medical corps, I never experienced any thing that was really anti-Semitic. In boot camp, we did have one black young lady who was treated the same as everyone else, and she went on to some other practice while I went into the medical corps, went to corps school down in Baltimore. We did run into what's the word I want to use? We ran into hate, surprisingly enough, when a group of us were going into Washington on the weekend, and we had some southern people and some northern. It was our group of class, and we were going on liberty. And we filled up the back of the trolley going down Wisconsin Avenue. And some lady, and we had to wear our white gloves. We had to be absolutely perfect. We could do nothing that would spoil the name of the waves. And a couple of ladies got on and proceeded to say nasty things about these females that were in the Navy, that we couldn't be very nice. And that hurt, that stung.
Mm-hmm. Let me just add that I was on a crew of 10, and there were, of course, that time no blacks and mixed in with it, but in my crew there was a Jewish member from New York City, and we had members from the South and from the West and Midwest. It was from all over the country. And after we were taken prisoner of war, that Jewish member of the crew was never segregated or anything. He was in the camp and so forth. So there was no anti-Semitic at all. He was just another member of the crew.
One of the things about military experience, which many civilians really have a hard time relating to, is the closeness you get to your comrades. Can you speak to that, Colonel Dart?
Well, you want me to?
Yeah, sure.
Well, we were all close because we all came up together. But we weren't accepted. Well, except for some of the other groups. But once overseas, we were treated just like everybody else. It was only in the United States where we had any problems. It was eye-opening. I'm trying to get to the end of this subject. I spent 14 months overseas, but when you come home, you find signs telling black soldiers or pilots where to go, and you go to different bases, and you find the German prisoners of war having to run at the base, and we couldn't go to certain parts of the PX or in the movie houses on base. We get stuck way back up in a roof someplace, but the German POWs had run at the base. They were just like any other white person in the United States. That didn't sit too well with us.
So John, a bomber crew is probably a pretty tight-knit
Bomber crew is very tight-knit. We trained together, we flew together, we went out together. Our favorite activity was skeet shooting, because that was giving you the perception and a follow and so forth as gunners. I have a younger brother, 7 years younger. I was closer as a member of that crew than I was with my brother. And it was just fantastic that how we felt together. It was amazing. And when we shot down and felt that and separated and so forth, that was a loss. We felt that we lost someone. But I've got to add, you mentioned the POWs, and I've got to add that when it comes to POWs, the Germans, remember we had the Italians, and that was the Axis powers, Italy, Germany, and then of course the Japanese. And when we returned and found the privileges they were receiving, I mean, there were outside Italian families accepting the POWs. And I know what American POWs, how they were treated by the Italians from North Africa. It was rougher than the Germans. So it was tough, let me tell you who it was. And you can't forget the fact they were Axis powers, Japan, Italy, and Germany. And we kind of shy, we could pick on one, but those, all three of them.
Paul, you get close to?
Well, you got me to thinking when you talked about the things that bring you close. I think any adversity in which you go through together with others will tend to bring you together. For us, the first time in our unit was when we were sent into combat training with the Marines. Jimmy Roosevelt's Raiders had gone to Macon Island, and we didn't know it at the time, but we were destined for that kind of an experience. And so they sent us to Camp Pendleton. Here we were, 220 GIs, suddenly thrown into this Marine camp. And those of you who have been with the Marines know what Semper Fi is all about. And immediately it was them and us. The interesting thing was, though, those of us who survived that training, when we came out of that training and sort of earned our spurs with the Marines, we then became the elite when we came into contact with other Army people. So, because we were special, we'd gone to this Marine training and had come through it, and we were molded into a unit. And that becomes even tighter after you've been in combat. After our first or second experiences in combat landings, we tended to hang always together, even when we were out of combat.
Major Gordon?
My experience is so much different than the other panelists up here in this subject. And I could spend an hour talking just in the opposite fashion.
Really?
Incidentally, you said in the beginning, Mike, that we on Baton surrendered. I'm going to clarify that. We were surrendered by our commanding general. Big difference. None of us surrendered. And had we known what was in front of us, no way would they have taken this guy.
Glad you clarified.
But we found out the hard way. But we do find out when you get into an adverse situation, such as being a prisoner of war. Remember, I was a prisoner of war 3.5 years. Not once, but 3.5 years. One thing I found was self-preservation, survival at all cost was the keynote. And when you strip away this thing we call civilization, like a thin veneer that we all wear, you find out what people are really like under those conditions. Of the 25,000 American prisoners of war held by the Japanese, 14,950 never came home. Those that survived were either fortunate or they took advantage of the situation they were in. But when you have your fellow Americans split so far apart in their attempt to stay alive, they will steal from their fellow prisoners, they will take food from their fellow prisoners, they'll do anything to survive. You don't have the same feeling that these gentlemen and ladies may have at this panel. So my experiences are not the same.
Thank you. Thank you. Ladies?
Oh dear,
You did it too.
you can dress me and you can't take me. First of all, we was never in combat. We went through boot camp, went through medical corps school, learned what we had to know, suffered the heat of Washington while we were doing this because we were in Bethesda Naval Medical Center. And we didn't have to worry about anybody shooting us, that was for sure. But our job was to help the patients who had come back from anywhere, who lived east of the Mississippi, who were amputees, who were blind, badly burned, anything that was a really traumatic happening to this person would get them into the either San Diego if they were west of the Mississippi, or the Philadelphia Navy Hospital if they were in the east of the Mississippi. And we kind of molded together, and there was a special feeling for the guys that we had to wake up at 6 in the morning to draw their blood so that they could look at all these little terrible little things that were floating around in their blood because they had been in Bataan and various places. And there was a special kind of concern for them. Their faces would have lumps because they worked in the lead mines. And they took such a beating, and it was so terrible that I haven't forgiven the Japanese. Maybe you have? I haven't. I don't want to own a Japanese car. I don't want to own anything that's Japanese if I can possibly help it, because I still can't bring that whole picture into focus and say, well, you've got to forgive. I'll let the next generations forgive.
Thank you. Mrs. Lewis?
Well, I was just going to say, if you think it was bad for the Army going into the Marines and training with them, you should have been a woman. They hated us too, especially the gunny
Right.
sergeants.
That's right.
So we could outshoot them and outrun them. I found that out. But it was interesting. I just realized that when radio school, I was the only woman in the whole school, and they were wonderful. I got all kind of respect. They were all nice. But I had two of what they're talking about now, the code talkers. I had one on each side of me, Navajos, and they were a riot. They were really funny. And it was hard to teach them the code. You know, they wanted to learn the code. It was hard to teach them, but they were fine. And they all went to Iwo Jima, my whole class. The day I was to graduate, I went in and my commanding officer met me at the door and he said, "You're on your own." And I look at him and, "What do you mean I'm on my own?" He said, "They all left. They all went to Iwo Jima." My whole class, I never knew what happened to them. They were all artillery spotters. That's what they did. Plus the two Navajos. Yeah.
We got 2 of them.
Did you really? Yeah, yep.
All right. Colonel Liberty?
We were in North Africa, and one night they came in, woke us up, and put us on little boats, LSTs, and landed us on Anzio. Now, the information had been wrong. We were supposed to be the 3rd wave. It was still the 1st wave. There was a lot of fighting going on. Our chief nurse stood about 5 feet tall. And when we got up off the beach and were walking along, this big man from Texas says, "Oh my God, you're women." She said, "That's right, deal with it." Well, they put us in bunkers. And then I realized why the Army taught me to crawl on my belly. When somebody'd get hit, they'd holler medic, and we would crawl over and pull him out of there and pull him over with us. And our 60 pounds of medical supplies came in handy. Now, I was the only Yankee in that group. The rest were all Texans. And that's when I learned the word damn Yankee was 2 words. But they were...
Actually, it was one word.
I was the only surgical nurse they had that was OR trained, so they had to put up with me. So I got along with them all right.
Mr. Scheisler?
I'd like to comment on Lieutenant Dart for a minute with your segregation problem. The Merchant Marine and the Maritime Service was not segregated at all. And we had no problem with it. We trained together, we worked together, and so on. That wasn't a problem. Some people have wondered how we work as a team in the Merchant Marine. And sometimes I sit back and wonder about it myself, because every trip that we left on would be essentially a new crew. And a lot of times, particularly a new ship. If you take a new ship out, these men have never seen anyone before, anyone else in the crew, but they're expected to work together. Every man is trained to do his job, and he did it. I recently talked with a group at West Point, and they were concerned about the line of command and how do you muster up cohesion among your group. And I said, I really don't know how it ever worked, because we never worked together before. We were not working as an experienced team, but we worked as a team. So that was quite a bit different from what you would experience if you were with someone for 6 months or a year or 2 years.
Michael, it just occurred to me, in really tricky situations, such as in the Merchant Marine when you're in a convoy and you're worried about submarines, torpedoes, etc., or in combat where you have a tight unit where everybody has a specific job in which the survival of the unit depends on everybody doing that job, just as in the plane. That's when the working together becomes a key factor, and that's when the tightness of a unit counts. When people forget their differences and all they're doing is focusing on the job of getting through whatever it is you have to get through. And the better you function as a unit, the better your chances of survival are. It's that simple. And you learn that.
As far as getting through goes, I'd like to make one point here. The state of New York should be pretty proud of the fact that they not only supplied the airplane factories and ammunition factories and everything else. This was the jumping off point for the bulk of all the material and the troops that invaded Europe. Convoys were made up in Norfolk, and Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. But by far and large, New York City, the port of New York, was the largest of the bunch. During the war, I brought some numbers along with me that might stagger you. There were 21,459 ships left just the port of New York. And each one of those ships is approximately 10,000 tons worth of war goods. Those ships, most of them were broken up into convoys, and there were 1,462 individual convoys sent across the Atlantic. These convoys might be anywhere from 30 to 100 to sometimes over 100 ships plus the escorts. That's an awesome sight. 100 ships and maybe 20 escorts around you, because the escorts were the only ships that had any detection devices on them. We were going bare bones as far as detection devices go. On the build-up to the invasion of Normandy, the port of New York had at anchor, loaded, crewed, and ready to go, 543 ships. And those were ships that were stacked up practically stem to stern and side to side from the lower battery up to north of where the Tappan Zee Bridge is today. Of course, it wasn't there then, but it was an awesome sight to see. And it's interesting to note that there was never one ship delayed because of a loss of a volunteer crew. Merchant Marine was 100% volunteer, and they never missed a shipment. It was a pretty good record, I think.
Well, thank you. The being in the military is really not noted for being a humorous thing. Can you recall any particular humorous events during your...
Yes, I can. Right after we got P-51s, they were brand new, and they were not the kind that you see in the pictures nowadays with the bubble canopies and dorsal fin up the back. Ours were the B's and C's, and they didn't have a dorsal fin or any reinforcement toward the back. And so one day, I wasn't in the flight, but there was a flight checking out the airplanes, and they were all in trail doing aerobatics. And so they pulled up and started doing vertical rolls. And one plane, the pilot couldn't recover, and he was in the airplane fighting, trying to get out of the spin. And so eventually he parachuted out. And so in the critique afterwards, everybody was trying to figure out what had happened. And so the pilot that this happened to, he eventually showed up on one of those Italian donkeys that are just a little bit bigger than a St. Bernard, and he had his parachute wrapped in his arms. And so the captain asked him what had happened. He says, I don't know. I started spinning and I tried to come out of the spin and I couldn't. But then another fellow in the group spoke up, the squadron clown. Says, well, I know what happened to you. Your tail came off. And so the pilot's name was Noel Allsbrook. He says, well, why didn't you tell me? Why'd you let me stay in the plane? He says, I was afraid you might do something foolish. That actually happened.
John? At the time, perhaps it wasn't very humorous, but let me explain that it's still, to this day, we talk about it from time to time when I meet a couple of crew members. We're on a 17-day forced march, and you never get enough food. You're always hungry and so forth. And this was a wet night, and we were just past a farm, and some of us said, we're going to go out to that farm and see if we can get any eggs or something like that, because we were never given enough food. Well, fortunately, the guards were further away. It was wet, and we wouldn't be crunching the leaves or branches or anything else that was on the ground. And we got to the farmhouse, we grabbed what eggs we could get, and then rushed back on our stomach, and we said in the morning, we'll have eggs for the first time. Well, and we had what we call a Smoky Joe we lighted. You couldn't do it at night, any lighting, because you couldn't have it. They weren't permitted to have any lights to give away, any signal lights. Lo and behold, we go to crack the eggs. They were ready to hatch. But let me tell you, it was good soup that we made from those.
Well, sometimes the most god-awful situations can lead to the most humorous ones. When we went into Okinawa, on the way there, before the landing, we received all kinds of lectures to prepare us for the landing. And one of the things they told us was that one of the customs of the Okinawans was to bury their dead in caves, much like the early Egyptians did. And they would put artifacts with them to accompany them to the next world, etc. And they told us that these caves were very sacred, and we were to stay away from them, leave them alone, because that would upset the Okinawans. Well, once we got ashore, a lot of the intelligence, as often happens in wartime, has to be changed once the battle starts. One of the things we learned was that the Japanese had huge 220 millimeter cannon and placed on one side of the island, and they let us come ashore, and then they just bombarded the daylights out of us. And finally the word came down, we were really getting pounded badly, and they said, if you find a cave that's already blown open, you may use it, you know, and it's now empty, you may use it for shelter. Well, it was at the height of a terrible barrage, and our lieutenant said, I found a cave, for God's sake, let's get out of this, and we went in. We had one man in the unit who was an inveterate gambler and always carried a pack of cards with him. Well, here we were sitting in this cave. We lit a small lantern, the smallest thing. We were sitting there. Immediately out came the cards, and he began to deal poker. We were sitting in a tight little circle. And as we went around, he said, wait a minute, somebody's light. And he turned to the guy next to him, and he jabbed him like this, and he said, are you going to ante up or not so we can get on with this game? And the fellow he elbowed fell over into the pot in the middle of us, and it was one of the mummified bodies in the cave.
Major?
This will be the shortest answer on the panel. I can't think of one thing humorous during the war, from my point of view. I wish I could, but I can't.
Okay.
Well, I was in the medical corps, as I said, and I ended up being a lab tech, which I had been before, only it was the organic lab, organic chemistry, not a medical technician. But I found myself, I was trained to draw blood. And for those of you who were in service, the term is a bloodsucker, right? That was where it was. But we had every morning we had a large number of people to be drawn, Navy and Marine. And in our own gentle way, we stood up as we started and said, now everybody, if you're wearing dress blues, take off your jumper. If you're wearing fatigues, you can roll up both sleeves so we can see which of your veins are better. And we'd move right along, and we would have a couple things happen. In one case, or many cases, we'd get some guy who would sit down in front of us and say, I always pass out when they draw my blood. And I said, oh? And yell into the urinalysis lab, would you bring out some smelling salts? And they'd bring out the carboy, the whole thing. And we'd be working as fast as we could, and we'd explain very carefully that we were in an amputee hospital, and that everybody on Ward E had lost their arm because if anybody's dumb enough to pass out, we just break off their arm and run the blood in. And these people, poor guys, they didn't know whether to do what, because could we really do this? After all, this was the Navy, it wasn't civilian world. And about the time when they kind of shook their head, we said, oh, you're all done, would you please get out of the way so we can go to the next one? And one time, I realized it afterwards, I had somebody came in front of me and he put out 2 ham hocks. I swear that his arm was this big. And I hauled off and I hit his arm so that the vein would come up, and I went in and I got it. And I kept on going. When we got down to Chow Hall, somebody suddenly blocked my way and said to me, look what you did to me. And there were 5 fingers and a hand on this man's arm. The whole hand was on that arm. And I go, oh my God, because I started to look up, and the 7'3" man is looking down at me, and if he ever hit back, I'd have been dead. But he said, you know, you're the first one that ever took my blood the first time. Thank you.
You hit him so hard.
Yeah.
Ms. Lewis?
Well, we had a lot of funny things, believe me, but I think the funniest was once again in boot camp. We were probably 115 in a company, and it was hot, and we wore garter belts in those days to hold up the wild stockings, right? My girlfriend in front of me, somehow, her garter belt let loose, and down it went, and our Marine sergeant, of course, wouldn't let it stop, and she looked just like a horse in hobbles, you know, I mean, really. And they wouldn't let it stop. We had to keep going just the same. We all got hysterical laughing. So we marched to midnight. I got news for you. They wouldn't let us stop for anything.
Colonel Liberty?
I hope my sister doesn't doesn't mind if I tell this story again.
That's not a good preface.
When we moved up from Anzio up towards Rome, we traveled in a small convoy with ambulances and stuff, and we would stop at these camps and renew the supplies, the medical supplies, and if there was anybody badly wounded, we would take them with us. And being a bunch of women, they didn't have any male nurses at the time, we had to go to the bathroom. So this one place we stopped, we all went into what they called the latrine, laughingly, and it was a slit trench. And we got slacks on. We can't go to the bathroom. So one of us went out and said to the chief nurse, we can't go in there, there's a slit trench. And she walked over to the commanding officer and she said, the girls can't use the slit trench. She said, they have to have another accommodation. And up to that time, we had had something. He looked down at her and he said, it's adequate. Use it. She said, my ladies are setters, not pointers. Fix it.
I can't top that. Now, there's only one that I recall, and I think it's not even original, but one fellow got a Dear John letter while we were on a long trip, and this girl asked for her picture to be returned, her photograph. So he was pretty upset about this, and he went around the crew and asked everybody if they had any extra pictures of girls. And he got about 6 or 8 of them. He sent them back and he said, I forgot which one you were, but he said, send the rest back.